So for as long as I can remember, there's a fascinating phenomenon that's taken place in my life every 4 years. I mean, it's like clockwork. Every 4 years, there's this small 2-week window of time where I become completely captivated by an activity that I typically could care less about. It happens every Winter Olympics. I get hooked on the sport of figure skating. Now, I know, but it blows my mind, right, to see what these athletes can do on ice. I can barely stand up on ice, and they are jumping and turning and spinning and doing all sorts of crazy stuff. It's just unbelievable to see. And like I just said, I never watch or even think about figure skating any other time. But when the Olympics roll around, I suddenly become an enthusiast. I find myself using words like double axel and triple lutz and salchow in my everyday conversations. And I've even been known to adopt the role of armchair expert. You know, I'll question and disagree with the decisions of the judges because, why wouldn't I? I've spent a good week researching the sport on Google. I've watched it on TV. So what does a panel of the world's highest ranked judges know that I don't? Now, I do realize how ridiculous I sound right now. But I want you to go a little bit further with me and imagine an even more ridiculous scenario. You see, back in Texas, in the last school where I taught, there was a young lady named Haley. And she was an incredibly accomplished figure skater. I don't use that term loosely. When I say accomplished, I mean she had a legitimate shot at eyeing the Olympics. Now let's just say, hypothetically, that one day after class, I went up to Haley and I said to her, Haley, I know you're working hard to compete at the highest level in figure skating. You've made tremendous sacrifices. You train for hours on end. I'm sure you've got some knowledgeable coaches working with you. They probably know what they're doing. But I just wanted you to be aware of the fact, I didn't know if you knew this about me or not, but I've been watching figure skating during the Olympics for like 20 plus years. And I thought, maybe I could offer you some guidance to help you along. You see, I've seen competitions. I've listened to the announcers on TV. I've even watched the movie Blades of Glory. And so here's what I think you ought to do. And then I would proceed to give her my sagely advice on how to be an Olympic figure skater. How absurd would that be? Watching a couple of weeks worth of figure skating every 4 years, it doesn't make me an expert on the subject. In fact, the truth is I don't know anything about that world. And so it would be silly of me to offer her advice. It would be even worse if she were to actually take it. Now, I want you to keep this scenario in the back of your mind as we read Colossians 2. That's the passage, or at least the passage in Colossians 2 we're going to be looking at today. And what you're going to notice is Paul, he uses verbs like judge and disqualify. And I think the picture he's painting here is one of a follower of Jesus competing for a prize much like one would in like an Olympic competition. So this is what Paul says. Therefore, don't let anyone judge you in regard to food and drink, or in the matter of a festival or a new moon or a Sabbath day. These are all things that the Jewish people held on to, right? And what Paul says, he said, these are a shadow of what was to come. The substance or reality is the Messiah. Let no one disqualify you from the prize, insisting on ascetic practices or self-denial, right? Or the worship of angels, or claiming access to the visionary realm and inflated without cause by their unspiritual mind. And so this is what Paul's getting at. He's telling the Colossians, you are all striving for a prize, a lot like an athlete in a competition. And so don't screw up your chances of attaining it by listening to people that don't have any idea what they're talking about. You can think about it this way. One fall Friday night, if I were to decide to go out to an Anacortes High School football game, and in the middle of the game, I just jump out of the stands, I go onto the field, I've got a whistle in my hand, and I start calling penalties on players. Should they listen to me? No, I have no authority or knowledge to be able to influence that game. And I think that's the point that Paul's trying to make. He's saying, don't disqualify yourselves. Don't sacrifice your victory because you followed the directions of some ignorant, self-appointed referees who don't know what they're talking about and don't have any authority. You see, the Colossians, they had all sorts of people that were offering them guidance on how to please God and how to obtain heavenly wisdom. But the problem was that these individuals, they didn't know anything about heaven. They didn't know anything about what it really took to please God. And so Paul's response, it's pretty straightforward. He said, you guys have Jesus, the fullness of God in human flesh. Why would you allow yourself to be taken off the right path? Why would you follow someone else's thoughts on heaven and God when you already have the real thing? I mean, that would be a disaster. And here's the truth for you and me. It's the fact that this threat of being led astray, because you and I choose to listen to the wrong voices, it's just as real and it's just as dangerous for us today. In fact, if I'm honest with you, I would say that this may be my biggest struggle in following Jesus. I mean, I'm a people pleaser by nature. I'm drawn towards the approval and applause of others. And there's this pull that's inside of me that just seems to gravitate towards the wrong voices. And when this happens, and it happens a lot more often than I wish it did, I consistently find myself measuring everything within me and measuring everything around me by a false set of standards and criteria. And what I've discovered based on my own experience is I really don't think I'm the only one who battles with this temptation. The temptation of having these moments where you find yourself caring more about what others think than what God thinks, or valuing human applause and approval over the applause and approval of Jesus. And so if you can relate to this on any level, I just want to challenge you with the question I've had to ask myself. And it's, how has listening to the wrong voices worked out for you? Because in my own life, I've discovered that anytime I've allowed the opinions and judgments of others to dictate my feelings and my behaviors and my personal value, it never ends up taking me anywhere good. I mean, it just leads me to become more preoccupied with the image that I project to other people rather than the substance of what's really going on with me. I find that in trying to project this world-pleasing image to those around me and to make a name for myself out in the world, I honestly just end up in some really bad places. Like, I can give you some examples. For instance, I began attaching my value and self-worth to performance, and I get caught up in the comparison trap. And this always leads me to some form of jealousy. Or another example, I become obsessed with receiving credit for the things that I've done. And it either goes one of two ways. Either I receive the acknowledgement and I become puffed up with pride, or I go unacknowledged and then I'm just full of resentment. Or here's another way. I take on the pressure of living to others' expectations. And so I live in just this constant fear of failing and letting people down. It even affects my relationships. There are those moments where I feel like everyone has to know that I have to be right, and so I have to get the last word in. And that just damages my relationships. Or I just avoid relationships altogether because I'm afraid of letting people into my reality. So just think about that for a minute. Anxiety, depression, fear, jealousy, resentment, pride, selfishness, damaged relationships or lack of relationships. I mean, does any of this sound good? And I don't want you to misunderstand. Please don't get me wrong. I'm not saying that we should not ever listen to other people. I'm not saying that we shouldn't care about our reputations. But what I am saying is this: as followers of Jesus, if we're not aware of the constant temptation that we face and the tendency we all have to follow and seek after the approval of the wrong voices, that we are going to be in very real danger of being taken captive by them, and we won't even realize it. And what's even worse than this is that we might miss hearing the right voice. Because you see, these deceptive voices that they sound really smart, but they're really ignorant, they're all around us. And they don't just impact how we see ourselves or other people, they also make claims about how we should relate to God. That was the issue that Paul was dealing with here in Colossians 2. You know, people, they were making claims to the Colossian believers on how they should please God, and their claims, they sounded really wise. You know, one group was endorsing this idea of pursuing special knowledge to gain spiritual enlightenment. There was another group that was saying, no, you need to practice asceticism or self-denial. You know, if you're hard enough on yourself, you know, that's going to get you into God's good graces. There was another group, other voices claiming, you know, just check all the right boxes, eat the right foods, observe the right rituals. That's what's going to get you to God. But the problem with all of these is this. They all promote the lie that we as humans can get to God on our own. And to our human ears, they sound deceptively sensible, even appealing. But Paul says that instead of getting us closer to God, they only drive a wedge deeper between us and Him. And for us today, you know, the specifics of these warped mentalities, they may be different, they may look different, but their root is still the same. It's born out of a lie that says, root your faith in yourself because you're good enough. You can do it. And as people, we love to hear this. But the message of Jesus is the exact opposite. That you and I were not good enough. We can't do it. You can't do it. Outside of Him, as we said last week, we are powerless, we are hopelessly opposed, and we are dead. And while this may be offensive and may sound offensive and be hard to hear, the beautiful truth is that Jesus is enough. And when we root our lives in Him and remain rooted in Him, it changes everything. And so here's how I want to close our time out together. I want to conclude with the question that Paul challenged the Colossians with, because I feel like it's just as meaningful for us to reflect on today. So here's the question he poses in verse 20. He says, if you died with the Messiah to the elemental forces of this world, then why do you live as if you still belong to the world? I mean, just think about it for a moment. That would be like a butterfly still thinking and acting like it was a caterpillar. No, a change has taken place. So why would you crawl an inch along when you could fly? And yet, do we not do the same thing as followers of Jesus? That we forget who we are, and then we see ourselves as we used to be instead of who we are now. And so that's my challenge to you. In what ways are you seeing yourself, as a follower of Jesus, are you seeing yourself in a way that's not correct? In what ways are you viewing yourself as the world sees you instead of embracing who you truly are in Him? Where are the areas of your life where you're choosing to crawl when you could be flying? And then why would you want to live like that? Why would you want to live in the old when you've been given and made new? Because you see, real hope and real strength and peace, real life, it happens when you and I uproot our faith out of ourselves and root our hopes and ambitions and lives completely in Him.